right, folks, we're going to go ahead and get started here. Good afternoon and welcome to the final episode in our Revolution Untold Lunch and Learn series. My name is Danny Devlin. I'm the Managing Director for Strategic Cultural Partnerships at William & Mary, and it's my pleasure to welcome you today. Before we begin, I want to let you know that today's event is being recorded. If you are uncomfortable or otherwise do not consent to being recorded, please allow this to serve as your notice to disconnect from Zoom now, and you can catch the session when we upload it to YouTube later this week. 2026 is the 250th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence, of the birth of the United States of America. Revolution Untold uncovers the overlooked stories of the cradle of democracy, of the people that shaped the nation in Williamsburg, Virginia. Revolution Untold is a public history project seeking to recapture and recenter the stories of the American Revolution, moving beyond the familiar cast of founding fathers to explore the lives of people who fought, suffered, resisted, and persisted through one of history's most transformative periods. 6 William & Mary students, supported by a William & Mary faculty member, have researched, written, and generated the foundational materials for a series of short-form documentary videos produced by the Williamsburg 250 Commission and designed to bring these overlooked stories to the broader public. Revolution Untold is generously sponsored by the Williamsburg 250 Commission, William & Mary Strategic Cultural Partnerships, and the Society of 1918 at William & Mary, and is made possible in part by a grant from the Virginia 250 Commission in partnership with Virginia Humanities. This is the final episode of Revolution Untold. We'll be premiering the students' videos at a broad range of channels in the coming weeks. To stay up to date with these upcoming events, please visit our website and subscribe to our newsletter at wm.edu/scp. I'm very pleased this afternoon to introduce you to Abby Tolliver. Abby is a history major from Leesburg who participates in Orchesis Modern Dance Company, Syndicate Hip Hop Dance Team, and is a member of Chi Omega. We're going to give Abby about 20 minutes to talk you through her research, and then we'll open the virtual floor to your questions and comments. If you would kindly take a moment to mute yourselves now, and if you have, and I'm also pleased to welcome Margaret McCarthy, who's joining us as well. Margaret is a government and history student from Winchester who participates in the William & Mary cheerleading team, Catholic campus ministry, and is a member of Kappa Alpha Theta sorority. So we're going to let Abby go first, and then Margaret will follow up. We'll give them each about 15 or 20 minutes to talk through their research, and then we'll open the virtual floor to your questions and comments. If you would kindly take a moment to mute yourselves now, and if you have any thoughts that pop up, please feel free to put them into chat, where I'll be monitoring that window during Margaret and Abby's presentations. I'm going to share my screen and turn the event over to Abby.
So I'm going to be discussing Nabby Adams and how her story as a historical children can help students understand historical complexities. And our goal is that we did that through our podcast episode about her. So my podcast episode with Nabby is actually narrated by Nabby. So just a little overview of Nabby Adams. She is the daughter of John Adams and Abigail Adams. She's the oldest child and the only surviving daughter, which creates a really interesting conflict within her family that we're going to get into later, or not necessarily conflict within her family, but conflict with different ideas that are discussed within the podcast episode. And then what's interesting about her childhood in specific is that her entire childhood took place during some of the most key events in the American Revolution. So troops were deployed in Boston when she was 3 years old, and the Boston Massacre occurred a year later when she was 4. But then the Treaty of Paris was signed the year she turned 18, which is really interesting. So could you go ahead? Thank you. So these are the podcast specific topics that I talk about. And so approaching each one of these, we kind of had 2 main questions, which were, how do we present these stories to children? They're kind of tough topics at moments. I don't have it on this list, but she mentions the Boston Massacre, and then inoculation is really interesting. But then ideas of equality, life, liberty, they're all kind of complex topics that are kind of just told to children, given a definition. But how do we present these stories and these topics more deeply to children? And then the other question was, how would Nabby have experienced these events? And that was the key question in creating the script for the podcast, because we don't have obviously primary sources of exactly how Nabby thought of the Boston Tea Party or exactly what she thought when she heard the Declaration of Independence for the first time. But we know where she was and we know what family she was in. And so that kind of gives us an idea of how she would have experienced these events. So I'm going to go through this list because it's kind of in 3 different sections. Um, so the first section of the podcast, Nabby is 8 years old, and she's discussing the conflict in the colonies. She discusses the Boston Tea Party, the occupation of Boston, and then how people are protesting and why they're protesting. And she's from outside of Boston, which is another important thing, because that definitely contributes to how she would have experienced these events. I related to growing up outside of DC. And when I was little, I knew that stuff was going on in DC from the news or from my parents. And even when I was 8 years old, I didn't understand exactly what was happening, but I understood that there was some sort of conflict or something going on, which is kind of how I approached this section with Nabby, because she's 8 years old and she's living outside of Boston and she's hearing things from her parents, especially having John Adams as a father. So, how would she have approached these topics? And so I think the key thing is that she would have asked questions. I think a lot of children are going to hear things and ask a lot of questions. So actually, that stays continuous throughout the entire episode. She's asking a lot of questions. And then when it comes to explaining things to children, since that this episode is narrated by Nabby, I wanted her to stay very childlike. So when explaining protests and taxes, she kind of explains it as like, this is what mama told me, which also plays into a role of she's asking these questions. She wants to know what's happening around her. The next section is about inoculation and smallpox, and I have that highlighted because the next slide's about that, so I'll skip past that for now. The final section is about the Declaration of Independence. Nabby is 11 years old at this point, and she attends a reading of the Declaration, and she hears different things, and like you kind of get a glimpse into her mind of like the thoughts she's having, and then at the end she's asking all these questions. She's asking, what does this mean for like what does this mean for my home, what does this mean for my family, but more importantly she asked what this means for herself. So if you could go ahead to the next slide. Thank you. So then this is about the inoculation. So just a little overview about Nabby's experience with inoculation. It was a pretty controversial practice, especially in Boston. A lot of people thought it was more deadly than actually contracting smallpox, despite evidence out there that it wasn't at the time. But then also the church often claimed that smallpox was a punishment for sin. So certain people were against it for religious reasons because they didn't want to go against God's will. But despite that, a lot of doctors still continued practicing inoculations in Boston. It was pretty controversial at the time. But John Adams got inoculated in 1764. A lot of the founding fathers got inoculated around this time. And then in 1776, Abigail Adams inoculated herself and her children, which is really interesting because they were inoculated for the first time on June 12th. But the children continued to be inoculated. So did Abigail, because if they didn't get sick, they would get inoculated again. So this was a summer-long thing. So they started their inoculation experience before the Declaration of Independence, and they finish it after, which creates a really interesting backdrop for this era in history. And then another important thing is that they were staying at their great aunt and uncle's house. So there was more than just one adult in Nabby's life at that time. So they were discussing things. They were having conversations about the Declaration of Independence, which also is kind of how we developed Nabby's story with the Declaration. When it comes to where we got like the research from, Abigail Adams actually wrote a ton of letters to John Adams at this time while they were in quarantine. And so that's where we got all this information. She discusses how many times each child was inoculated. So that goes in the podcast. She discusses what they're doing to treat it. So that goes in the podcast. So it was actually pretty cool to see Abigail Adams letters and use that as the backdrop for what's happening, and then know what else is going on at the time. Know that John Adams is away writing the Declaration of Independence, so building what Nabby's thinking and what questions she's asking on top of that. If you could go to the next slide. Okay, so then having all those topics and understanding how Nabby might have experienced them was one thing, but then we wanted to get certain ideas across and reframe her story as a child and see how that changes her story. Because yeah, she was the daughter of John Adams and the sister of John Quincy Adams, but she grew up during a very interesting time. And by solely focusing on her childhood and the family she was in when she was a child and the place she lived when she was a child, you can see a lot of cool historical themes like gender dynamics, equality, having like her radical mother, and then like what does a child's perspective mean. So those are kind of the themes we wanted to introduce by reframing her story as a child. If you could go ahead. Thank you. So these are kind of the ones I just discussed. Equality is like the first main one, equality when it comes to gender dynamics. So what's interesting is that John Quincy Adams participated in diplomatic ventures as young as 14. He also served informally as secretary to American commissioners on the negotiation of the Paris Peace Treaty, which was really interesting. And he was a child at that time as well. And they're only like 2 or 3 years apart, which creates an interesting conflict within the family, especially because Nabi's the only daughter. So she sees her brother being able to participate in all these things when he's actually younger than her, that she's not able to participate in. And at the same time, her father is a founding father and he's preaching for equality and freedom. So that creates another interesting conflict. It's like she hears her father discussing how important equality is, but he's not treating her equally to her brothers, which is really interesting. And then again, her mother, we know that she reminded John Adams to remember the ladies. She was pushing for women's inclusion in the Declaration of Independence. And so it's likely that Nabi might have heard her discussing that. But even if Nabi didn't hear her discussing that, it's also likely that Abigail Adams pushed Nabi to have more liberty as a woman than a lot of her friends' mothers might have at the time, which also adds to this idea. Was Nabi asking questions? Was Nabi confused why her father was preaching for equality while she wasn't getting that equality herself? So that goes into the child's perspective, which is kind of what we've talked about throughout this entire thing, which is, to me, a lot of questions. They can understand what's going on and they understand that there's conflict and they want to understand it at a greater level. And then if you could go to the last slide. So then that plays into the historical narrative and how we share Nabi's stories with children. So a lot of the time when I was researching Nabi's adult life, it was her birth date, her marriage date, the date of her first child's birth, and then her death date, which is true for a lot of women of the time. It also includes this is her father and this is her husband. And she wasn't given the same opportunities. So she wasn't able to achieve the multitude of things that John Quincy Adams achieved. But by viewing her childhood, the historical narrative behind her becomes so much larger. And she's more than just that birth date and that death date. She represents the complexities behind the Declaration of Independence and behind Enlightenment and behind a lot of the ideals behind the American Revolution. I think specifically her and her father represent that perfectly. While he's preaching for equality, he's not giving her equality. And I think that is a perfect representation of one of the key complexities that we discussed today behind the Declaration of Independence. And you can see that in a lot of other people. And then when it comes to sharing Nabi's story with children, I think, we could share Abigail Adams' story and kind of get the same sort of thing where her husband is preaching for equality, but not giving her equality. But by using a child, first of all, they can see themselves as a historical actor, which is very important. I mean, I think it's far more interesting when I see a woman in history because I see myself in a historical actor, but also Nabi's raising the types of questions that children would be raising if this was happening today. So it kind of leads them into critical thinking and analyzing in a way that just telling them about Abigail Adams wouldn't. And then I think my own biggest takeaway is pretty much what I've been discussing the past two slides is that Nabi has her story out there now, and it's that she's John Adams' daughter. But by taking that simple story and then investigating it deeper and looking at what's going on at the time and where she was when things were happening and who she was with and where she lived, you can really represent some of the complexities that we discussed today with someone who has an ordinary story. So that's my podcast episode. And any questions, or are we waiting to do questions after?
We will get to questions after. Thanks, Abby. Great job. Let's welcome Margaret to speak about James 4:10, please.
All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. It's hard to follow up Abby's presentation, but I'm going to tell you a little bit about my podcast episode, which is about James Forten, who was an American abolitionist, activist, businessman, and also a privateer as a child during the American Revolution. Next slide, please. Thank you. Okay. So, James Forten was a free African American man or child in this era in Philadelphia who heard the Declaration of Independence for the first time as a child, where he lived near the old State House and actually down the street from the First Continental Congress. So he got to experience firsthand these ideals of freedom and equality being formed and expressed in a very public way for the first time. And then also during this time in Philadelphia, there's a lot of growing colonial unrest. So these revolutionary rhetorics were, being expressed and thrown around significantly throughout his hometown. And while he was freed as an African American boy, he actually didn't experience the same freedom that was being preached. Next slide. So the process of the research or making this podcast was very unique. I had done historical research before, but I had never really been engaging with this whole like conceptualizing an idea, putting it together, and then actually having an end product. So it was very fun to experience that for the first time. But yeah, so for my research, we worked with a team and we looked into Revolutionary America, James Fortin, how to relay this content and express it to children in a way they would understand. And then also learning these new technologies and softwares to formulate podcasts, slides, that sort of thing. So the research was actually an interesting bit because, like a lot of these stories, like focusing on the children, you can normally hear more so about their adult life, especially with James, who had a very significant adult life and a very prominent impact on history as he was fighting for equal rights. He was a sailmaker and he had a very successful business, which was very unique at the time as an African American man in Philadelphia. Um, so it was a little bit of a challenge to look into how he operated as a child and different accounts of his life there, and then also how to express them well. So that's where the formulation step comes in. So we were kind of brainstorming how to relay this information and how to connect with kids. And one thing that we found was fun was kind of leaning into the idea of pirates. So privateers were actually more like pirates as opposed to Navy men. So while the American Navy still existed, there was actually the privateers that were set out to fight British ships at the time. So that's what James did, and it was fun to lean into that and to try to express these ideas of what James did as a child to something that kids like, which is pirates. So then the editing step was learning how to like find little sounds to fit in to make it exciting, and then creating these additional materials to engage with the audience. So we'll be speaking at the public library soon, and we'll get to have activities to help them not only engage with the material that we had made, which is the podcast, but to also understand this era of history more. Because it can be very difficult or seem kind of boring if you're a child and you're just learning about these old men who, wrote a couple documents and said things. And it's actually very exciting, and we want them to be able to learn and engage, and then to apply this history to their life. Next slide, please. So speaking of applying this history to your life, I came across a quote from James Fortin in my research, which helped me understand why this research matters. So James said, while so much is being done in the world to ameliorate the condition of mankind, and the spirit of freedom is marching with rapid strides and causing tyrants to tremble, may America wake from the apathy in which she has long slumbered. So I thought this quote was pretty interesting, and um, throughout my studies at William Mary, I've learned that history is such a fruitful subject to look into and to learn about and to apply it to your life. And I'm a government history double major, so it's been interesting to see history and the use of that being applied to diplomatic and political decisions. But I also think that this is a very unique and very worthwhile way to engage with history too, is teaching children about the world around them and then how they can make an impact as well. So a big part of James's story, we wanted to tell children that kids can be strong and brave and they can have an impact on the world around them. So while James had a lot of struggles throughout his life, when he was young, his father died. So it was just him and his older sister and his mother. So he's actually the youngest, and he had a lot of responsibility on him as a child. He worked, he became a sailmaker, and he did some odd jobs just to help his family get by. So he actually had to drop out of school to do that. Um, so while he was working, he was hearing about this people preaching about freedom and equality, and he was experiencing pretty much the very opposite of that. And then when he was a child, still, he enlisted, so he became a privateer and he was only 14, which was still considered a child in all of America's colonies at the time. So kind of surprising that they would even let him enlist and put his life on the line for the country. But it's a cause that he really believed in. He really believed in making sure that everyone was free and equal, even though he wasn't experiencing that. It didn't discourage him. So I thought his story was very moving and was very inspiring. And I really wanted children to be able to kind of experience that same feeling that I did when I first read this. And then I think even today, his words are still applicable, that anyone can have an impact on the world and can fight for what they believe in. So, yeah, next slide, please. So my takeaways from the podcast. This is an image that I found on James Fortin's historical site. So he, like I had mentioned, was a sailmaker as a child, and he actually turned that into his very successful business. And it made his family one of the wealthiest free Black families in all of Philadelphia. But I thought it was a nice metaphor as well. So I wrote, history is a needle and thread. We use to stitch the torn fabric of the present back together, one remembered story at a time. So I think I also just throughout this experience learned that history, while it's important and what I've mostly been engaging with it in it with is which is diplomacy and politics. It's also very important for just engaging with the present in any sense, and then also learning from the past to make today a better place. Just as James was doing, he really wanted to make the world around him better, even though he wasn't experiencing that. So I think we can learn from his story. And I think it's also important to share the story with the children of today, and inspire them to do something revolutionary. And that's it. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. Great job, Abby. Great job, Margaret. Thank you for sharing your research here. I'd like now to open it up to questions from the audience. If you have any, you can pop them in chat or put your hand up and come on camera. We have a question from Ashley Glaisel. I apologize if I'm not pronouncing that correctly. Ashley is asking, when is the podcast out and where can we find it? Abby and Margaret.
So we're debuting our episodes, I believe it's May 9th, at the public library here in Williamsburg. So we're having an event for children, where they can go. We'll have different worksheets, coloring sheets, and crafts that they can engage with while they're listening to the podcast, and we can teach them about this period of history as well. And then after that, it will be, I guess, released to the public.
Excellent. Ashley also notes that I nailed the pronunciation. That's very rare, so I'm going to take credit for that. I have a question for both Abby and Margaret. I wonder if you can talk to me about through your other research, your other classwork here, William and Mary, or other kinds of research writing you've done. What has the difference been in trying to embody a child's voice or a child's perspective versus maybe some of the other papers you've had to write? And think about that pretty broadly. This is a research, but also a creative process. Does that change the writing or the calculus at all? And how is that informed, or how does that inform embodying a child's voice or a child's perspective?
I think it's been really interesting. I actually took Dr. White's children's history class last semester, so and I'm only a freshman, so I've spent more time than you would think studying children's history. And I think one of the most interesting things is how the definition of a child changes so drastically. So
Interesting.
when you're studying a certain child, you have to view them how people back then would view children. So like with marriage laws or like the age of adulthood, you have to think about how were those children considered children today, or are we putting our ideals of children that we have today on them? And I think that's the biggest thing. I think when it comes to like this episode with Nabby, I didn't see that as much, but I definitely still saw it. I mean, she got engaged for the first time at age 18, which was the norm back then and not the norm today. And so you have to think about that when you're studying the certain child.
Yeah, that's a great answer, Abby. And Margaret, I'm going to turn to you in a second, but I also want to say I really appreciate that Margaret spelled that out for us, that 14 was for James was still considered childhood when he enlisted and became a privateer. So great point, Abby. Margaret, please, I'm sorry to have cut you off.
Oh, no worries. So on the opposite side of that, I'm a senior graduating this May. So I studied both children's history with Professor Holmza as my history technology requirement. And then this semester, I actually did my big history major capstone. With a class with Professor Butler called History and the Diplomat. So obviously, there's no children really engaging in diplomacy at that level. We were focusing mostly on the interwar period. So my research was on Jesse Owens and sports diplomacy and how different nations use that to propagate their ideals, and then Jesse's experience as an African American man in Nazi Germany, and then also how he experienced that sort of racism both at home and then abroad. So I think it was different too. There was more materials, obviously, because the 1936 Berlin Olympics were a very public event, and they had more autonomy in terms of like the competitions. And Jesse Owens went to the Ohio State University, so he had more freedom to, I suppose, express his ideals, or maybe it was more public, so that was easier to find. But I found contrasting with my previous history class last semester, where I focused on children's history, I learned that some people think that the field of children's history in general is kind of, for lack of a better term, a waste of time. And they think that children who really do have an impact on history are just adultified and they're not really truly children. So there's no point in studying them. But I found that there's so many interesting examples of children having an impact and independence and their own autonomy in their own way, and engaging with history and the public in that way. So it's really interesting to explore the broad and fruitful like field of study that it is. So there's children who are witches and criminals, and also like saints, and it's just so amazing and to look into, and then also very under researched.
Great answer. From Emily, once the podcast is available to the public, where will it be? Will it be hosted on YouTube? Any idea about podcast hosting strategy?
I think Dr. White is still trying to decide upon a platform. So I think she's considering YouTube, Spotify, but we're not certain yet. So once she does, I think we'll release that information on the Instagram.
Great. Margaret, from Margaret Tolliver, not Margaret McCarthy. How was Nabby influential as a grown woman? Perhaps not as much so her mother Abigail was.
Unfortunately, there's really not a lot of information about Nabby out there. One interesting thing was that she died of breast cancer, but she had multiple experimental surgeries, which maybe not, she wasn't making that, she wasn't doing those surgeries herself and performing those, but I do think that was influential at the time. But unfortunately, there's not a lot of information out there as an adult. She was kind of a little bit of a, what's the word? She went against her parents like pretty often. She got engaged at 18 against, they didn't like this boy at all, but that engagement failed, and then she got married later and had a very interesting relationship with a lot of financial crises. But for the most part, her history as an adult woman is um is just in the home and like in her marriages.
That's an interesting point. It sort of points back to exactly a point you highlighted earlier, where histories of children, and I think of women in that time period, are generally disempowered, right? They're unprivileged by the historical record. Really interesting question. And one last one from Margaret Tolliver. Will Dr. White use your research and podcast in her development of materials for school children?
Yeah, actually, so one of the main goals when making this podcast was to make it usable for her children. Love to listen to these sort of things in the car, so to be able to listen to that and have the fun sound effects to keep you engaged. But then also we're making materials so teachers can use it in their classrooms. So we cut our podcasts up into different sections, so teachers can play a part and then have questions or a worksheet or some other activity to engage with after every single section. And we're also working on videos, so teachers can display that in their classrooms and children can read the transcripts and follow along as they work on their worksheets.
That's terrific. Well, that's going to bring us to a close today. Thank you for joining us for our final Revolution Untold Lunch and Learn. Great job, Abby and Margaret. Join our mailing list for updates and reminders by visiting us on the web at wm.edu/scp. We will also make sure to post the podcast location when that's finalized, when that comes out. I want to repeat that we are extremely grateful to our sponsors, the Williamsburg 250 Commission, the Society of 1918, the Virginia 250 Commission, and Virginia Humanities, and donors to Strategic Cultural Partnerships, whose generous support has made this research possible. By sharing these stories, we remember more fully, understand more clearly, and we expand the story of the American Revolution. Thank you so much for joining us. Have a great afternoon, everyone.